We've got a lovely array of speakers talking about a few different things that I think you're going to find very interesting. And what I also wanted to say was this webinar is coming, I think, at a really critical time. We hear a lot about the biodiversity crisis. It's on the back of the Secretary of State, George Eustice, making significant announcements yesterday by the government about how they're going to help reverse the decline in nature. And they launched those initiatives at a Wildlife Trust Reserve in Delamere with our colleagues in the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. And as I was talking to Dave Goulson, who's going to be speaking tonight, lots of fine words. Obviously, we need to see that translated into firm action for nature's recovery. The Wildlife Trust has a very clear target of 30 by 30. That's 30% of land and sea managed effectively for nature, where nature is flourishing and is abounding. So that is quite a target. The government is trying to move to that target with legal mandatory targets for biodiversity to address that decline. And we're going to be focusing tonight particularly on insects and bees. And many of you will be aware of the frightening studies that have come out, and Dave will talk about this, about the collapse in insect numbers globally. I was looking at it just before, earlier before, about 40% of insect species declining globally. 1/3 of those are endangered. I was staggered to see that the rate of extinction in insects is 8 times faster than in mammals. Dave obviously knows all about this. And that potentially losing insects is catastrophic from an ecosystem point of view. But tonight, we're also going to talk about how we can address that and how we can address that locally, because there are some really important things that we can do where everybody can be involved to help address the insect problem. And that's what I think is going to be really exciting to talk about tonight. So we've got 3 speakers, which I'll just quickly kind of run through. Diane, my colleague, Diane Gould, is going to talk about our exciting new Grow, Don't Mow campaign. And I'm delighted that Emma Mortimer is joining us from Derbyshire Dales District Council. Thank you so much, Emma, to talk about a really exciting roadside verge project that she's leading on for the council. And then so delighted to have Professor Dave Goulson, world expert on bees and insects. Be pleased to know I've got your latest book, Dave, which is absolutely wonderful. I've enjoyed reading that. It's going to be my Bible to do better things for bees in my garden. So Dave Goulson's will be giving the main talk about bees and the issues around bees, and actually what we can all do to help stop their decline. So it's a full agenda, and we're going to have a break after Dave has given his presentation, and then we're going to come back for questions, because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions tonight as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to, and just to, by the way, just say as well that this will be recorded. I said at the beginning, this will be recorded, so people who can't make it or would like to see it again, it will be recorded, and my colleagues will be making that information available in due course from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. So I'm going to hand over first of all to my wonderful colleague Diane Gould, who's going to give a short presentation on this exciting new campaign that Derbyshire Wildlife Trust has just launched, Grow, Don't Mow. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Tim. So this year, we are asking people to take part in our Grow, Don't Mow challenge. It's an easy way for you to make a massive difference and really help the wildlife on your doorstep. Many challenges and campaigns do ask you to make quite substantial commitments in terms of money or time. But the really great thing about Grow, Don't Mow is that not only is it free, but it actually requires you to make less effort than you did before you signed up for it. It's got to be a winner, hasn't it? What we're asking is for you to leave your lawnmower in the shed or in the garage and leave your grass to grow. It's your choice whether you want to just turn a small patch of your garden or if you want to leave the whole area to go wild. So we've got 2 challenges to choose from. There's the mini garden challenge and the full wild back garden challenge. And once you've started, we would love to see pictures of the changes you see and what you notice in terms of the wildlife that you discover that's there now. But it's not just the wildlife that will benefit from you taking part. Research shows that environments can increase or decrease our stress. What you're seeing, hearing, and experiencing not only changes your mood, but also how your hormone, nervous and immune systems are working. Being in an unpleasant environment can cause you to feel anxious, sad or helpless, which then in turn elevates your blood pressure, heart rate and muscle tension. A pleasing environment reverses this. Nature helps us cope with pain. We're genetically programmed to find trees, plants and nature engrossing, and this distracts us from the pain and discomfort that we might be feeling. Studies also show that nature has a positive impact on our mood as it leads us to be more calm and balanced. So irrespective of our age or our culture, humans find nature pleasing, and that in turn is good for our mental and physical health and well-being. We do need to do more than just be in nature. When you're outdoors, it's really easy to become distracted, to think about your problems or your shopping list or what you've got to do at work and not really notice nature. To get the real benefits, you need to make time to notice the beauty in nature and discover what the meaning of nature is to yourself. So we're all busy people. Where do we get this time from? It's easy with this challenge because the time you would have spent mowing your lawn, you can use instead to nurture yourself. Spend that little bit of time every week connecting with nature, noticing the differences that you have made simply by putting the lawnmower away. If you sign up for the challenge, we've got videos and resources to suggest different nature connection activities that you can take part in. And so after this webinar, if you're feeling inspired by everything you've heard, head over to our website and sign up to Grow, Don't Mow.
Great, thank you so much, Diane. So Diane's thrown down the gauntlet there to everybody about putting your lawnmower away. Hopefully many of you are going to accept that challenge, and we're going to be delighted to hear from you about that. Thank you so much, Diane. I'm going to move over now to Emma. And Emma is a Community Development Officer at Derbyshire Dales District Council. And Emma has been leading a roadside verge project for the council within Derbyshire. And we know this is an issue that so many people care about. And particularly, I was talking to Emma recently, particularly in COVID times, how people have noticed more their roadside verges. And if you see on social media, there's so much talk about the need for our roadside verges to become better areas for wildlife, for wildflowers and for insects. So, and it's going to explain to us all the project that they're developing in the Derbyshire Dales district area. And I'm delighted that I know quite a few of the local authorities have joined this webinar, and if they can't make it, they've asked to see it later on. We are determined that we need to develop a nature recovery network that intimately involves roadside verges across the whole of Derbyshire and beyond. They are and could be incredibly important areas for nature in terms of connectivity, beautiful places for people to see, and incredible places for insects. So over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Right. Okay, there we go. This is the first year of a 3-year project that the council's running to increase the biodiversity on land that we own or have responsibility for. And although, you know, biodiversity has been on our agenda for a while, it started this year really as a direct result to COVID and lockdown. Because last year, like many local authorities, we were really short-staffed. We had staff that are shielding or self-isolating, and we had to prioritise our work. And the cutting of the urban road verges was one of the things that was further down on the list. The rural road verges we contract out, so they weren't affected. Anyway, come the summer, we started to get lots of comments from the public and from our own members saying how wonderful it was to see these wildflowers, and can we please leave them uncut until the end of the summer. So we went out and had a look, and we were taken by surprise. On the slide here is some of the verges that we saw in Matlock and Cromford. So we had to check in terms of safety, because obviously traffic visibility is really important, and also to, to check whether they would cause obstructions to pedestrians. So those that were fine, we left uncut, and then we cut at the end of September. So once we've done that, we thought, well, we've got to carry on doing this. So we investigated it further, took a report to committee, and set up a biodiversity working group. And this group consisted both of relevant officers, but also members. This was a council-wide supported project. And so we chose 12 pilot sites. We chose to focus on the urban road verges, and chose 12 sites because we wanted to make sure that we knew what we were doing, the whole practicalities of it, and that we could manage these sites well. Because one of the issues is that come September, when we cut them, we don't have a machine that cuts and collects. We have to rake this by hand. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to do that. And the other thing is that we also wanted to use this year to inform the public, because the success of this project isn't just about the wildflowers and the insects that we attract. Obviously, that is the main thing, but it is also to get people on board with this, because if we wanted to expand this out into any significant numbers, then we need to get the public to be with us. So we're using this time to actually inform and educate the public on why we're doing this, why it's so important. So to begin with, what we first did was we took all the verges, we cut the grass really short, and collected the clippings. And then some of the sites which weren't quite so rich in wildflowers, we scarified. And the idea behind that was to create bare patches. And that was to enable the community groups to sow seeds or put plants in there, but also a chance for any of the seeds already in the soil to germinate. And now what we're doing at the moment is publicising what we're doing. People in Derbyshire may well have seen it on social media, and also in the press, and our council magazine that goes to every door in Derbyshire Dales. And we've also produced a sign as well, so that this sign is going out to print at the moment, so that every verge that we're being left for wildflowers will have the sign, so that there's no mistaking it. There's no thinking that the council's kind of forgotten to mow this bit, or we're trying to save money, but we're doing it for very positive reasons, for wildflowers, bees and other pollinators. And, I do think that there has been a significant change in people's attitude towards nature, particularly since the pandemic, as our world has shrunk and to the immediate environment. I think it's opened many people's eyes to what's around them, and to appreciate it, and the need to look after nature. So what we're going to be doing next is, come June, is we're going to survey all the verges and take photographs, and use this as part of monitoring it. And also the photographs can be used again in publicity. And then come the end of August, beginning of September, the verges will be cut, vegetation raked off, removed and composted, because that's going to be essential for a wildflower meadow, is that you need to remove those arisings. So, that has been our approach. We're trying to work with what's already in the verges and in the surrounding areas. And some of these verges are quite rich in wildflowers already, so it's just a matter of managing them appropriately. And for those that have less in the way of wildflowers, what we're doing is, by cutting and removing the vegetation twice a year, we're gradually reducing the soil fertility, and then this will reduce competition, and we should see an increase in number of species and populations over time. Because Derbyshire Dales is rich in wildflowers, particularly in the limestone and gritstone areas, and that many of our verges that were chosen, although they're urban, they are within the villages, so they're quite rural. And we want these verges to be full of locally native flowers, rather than flowers from say like a wildflower seed mix. I mean, that's not to say that, you know, they don't have their place, and we may well look at these mixes for some of our parks for next year, or even roundabouts, that sort of thing. But, you know, community involvement has been really important. It's been invaluable for the project. We're currently working with 4 groups in Derbyshire Dales, and not only has their actual practical input allowed us to take on extra sites, and particularly those which may not have that many wildflowers in it, they're also ambassadors, because they're spreading the message across their local communities, and helping people to understand, you know, what we're doing and why we're doing it. This is a group, Wilder Works With, which set up last year, and what they've been doing is the members have been collecting plants, native plants that have been growing in their gardens, things like primroses and oxeye daisies and foxgloves and red campion, and they've been growing those on so that when we cut the turf and we scarified it, you can see this probably from the slide, there's some bare patches there. They've been planting out those potted plants in the verge, and been, you know, generally looking after them. And they're going to be great come September, because when we cut the grass, they've offered to rake that up into piles, and we'll come and remove it. So that's brilliant. They've been a fantastic group. Another group that we are working with is the Bradwell Wild Project, and this is an interesting one, because for a number of years in Bradwell, they've actually wanted their verges cut more frequently. I mean, to be fair to them, occasionally we've had to miss one out because of the bad weather, which has meant that we couldn't get the machines on the verge. But we were surprised to get a request from Bradwell that they wanted to be part of this trial. So we said, yes, that would be brilliant. They've chosen 6 sites across the village, and the parish council has agreed that they can do this on a 1-year trial. 4 are mowed by us and 2 by the parish council. And the community have been out collecting the local seeds and growing them. And what they've done is they've grown 500 plants, and they've planted them out across the 6 sites. And interestingly, what's happened on this site at Beggars Lane is that they put a fence with rope across it. And the idea was to prevent our guys from accidentally mowing it. But actually, I think what they've created is an area that something that really states that this is a special place. You know, it has even a touch of a kind of a picket fence about it, and makes it quite attractive. And they've involved, you know, the school in here. The school have been taking part in the Every Flower Counts as part of No Mow May. So they've been comparing quadrats within the short mown grass to the long mown grass, and just seeing the difference in the number of wildflowers. So it's great that they've got all sorts of people, all sorts of parts of the community involved in this. And I did ask them last week. I said, well, you know, what has been the reaction to this project, to leaving the grass growing long? And they said at first there was a lot of concern. Would the litter collect in with the long grass? Would there be more dog fouling? Will there be issues with traffic visibility? And she said, well, none of these have materialized. And in fact, the overwhelming reaction of the village is a really positive one. So we've gone from a village where they wanted the grass cut even shorter to one where they're embracing the wildflowers in their verges. So, I mean, that's a real achievement. Right. Now, next steps. So we've got these 12 sites. We're hoping that next year that we can increase the number of wildflower verges, and I suspect that we will probably get a lot more community interest through the publicity. And we're also looking at increasing the biodiversity of our parks and open spaces. This is an image of Hawley's Park, which is the main park in Matlock, and it has a river running along one edge of it, which is full of wild garlic. So we'll be looking at, you know, of leaving uncut a strip along the riverbank, and then some other places, probably Bakewell and Ashbourne as well, will be looking at that. And as I say, extending a number of road verges. But one of the things that we also need to look at is and investigate is the equipment to manage these wildflower areas, because it's we can't extend the work that we do that much if we're having to rake it by hand. So we need to look at machinery that can cut and collect at the same time, and whether that is something that we buy or we hire. But at the moment, or we're about to start a review of the service, which is looking at staff and equipment as well as other things. So that's something that we'll be looking at later on this year. And the other thing that we want to do is to work with Derbyshire County Council, who are reviewing the management of their road verges for wildflowers. Because I think that's going to be crucial. That's going to make a big difference, because the rural road verges are going to be great at creating wildlife corridors, linking the urban verges and all the other kind of projects, nature conservation projects that are happening across our towns and villages. And they will be linked together by these verges. So we're really keen to see some changes here and want to work with the county on that. So that's where we are. If you're interested in learning more about road verges, wildflower road verges, then I suggest that you visit the Plant Life website. They're running a road verge campaign, and they've got some really good booklets which are full of really useful information. So well worth having a look at that. Okay, thank you for listening. Nope.
Tim, you just need to come off mute.
Do apologise. Thank you so much, Emma. That's wonderful to hear the initiative that's going on in Derbyshire Dales District Council. And hopefully, we know there are other similar projects going on in other parts of Derbyshire. We would be really encouraging other local authorities and district councils to really have a look at the opportunity to really expand roadside verges for wildlife, for flowers and for bees and pollinating insects. And from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust point of view, we're also very, very keen to work with partners to actually help make this happen. So we are able then to develop a nature recovery network with many, many different partners and people involved across the whole of Derbyshire. We think that would be a significant step forward to helping us reverse nature's decline across the county. So thank you so much, Emma, for that. And as my colleague has said, if you have any questions for Emma, please do pop them in the chat, and we will be coming back to questions after the break. So please, if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat. So we're going to move on to our next presentation, and I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Dave Goulson agreed to give a presentation tonight. Many of you will be aware of Dave's work. He's written a string of books. I think I mentioned earlier, I've got the latest, which is an absolute wonderful book about gardening for bumblebees, a practical guide to creating a paradise for pollinators. Dave is Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex, specialising in the ecology and conservation of insects, particularly bumblebees. So as many of you know, Dave is a world expert on bees and pollinating insects and has done some incredibly important work to highlight the plight of our insects. Dave founded Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006, which aims to reverse the decline of bumblebees. Many of you again will know that organisation. So I'm absolutely delighted that Dave is going to talk to us tonight about the bees and insects, the plight that they face, but also how we can all work together to reverse what is a very worrying decline. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, and Dave is going to talk to us about that as well. So thank you very much, Dave. Over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone for tuning in. So I'm going to talk not just about bees, but about insects generally tonight. I've been fascinated by insects all my life. some of my earliest memories, I don't know why, but when I was only 5 or 6 years old at primary school, I remember finding there was some groundsel on the edge of the school playground and these little yellow and black caterpillars. And for some reason, I collected them up and put them in my lunchbox and took them home and reared them up. And they eventually turned into these beautiful red and black moths, which I guess some of you might recognize from the description as cinnabar moths. But I just thought that was kind of magical and was hooked, and have been lucky enough to be able to spend, I get paid to chase around after insects, which is as far as I'm concerned, very nice indeed. I can't quite believe anyone pays me to do this. Anyway, before I continue rambling on anymore, let me just share my screen with you. Shouldn't take a second. Let's go full screen with it. There we go. So actually, I mean, it might sound terribly nerdy to be into insects as a kid, but I think lots of children, given half a chance, are really fascinated by insects. This is my youngest son, Seth. He's 10, and this was a picture from a couple of years ago now. There he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin. And Seth's still very much in his insect phase. He loves them and he likes to capture them and feed them and learn their names and keep them in jam jars on his windowsill and so on. And as I say, I think lots of people do that if they're lucky enough to live in a place where there are insects for them to interact with. But most people grow out of it, and by the time they're teenagers or adults, most people's reaction to insects is not a favourable one. If something buzzes near them, they're more likely to swat it than anything else. They're frightened. They think it's going to sting them or bite them. And that's really sad, I think, because insects are really important. So and also I think they're really fascinating. So I spend my life trying to persuade people to love insects, or at the very least to respect them for all the important stuff that they do. But before I talk more about insects, let me just kind of remind you of the big picture here. This might all seem a little bit cliche, but I think it's important to bear this in mind. So this obviously is our planet, and we kind of take it for granted. We rarely stop to think about it. But actually, it's the most remarkable thing, you know, this rock hurtling through space with us, and well, so far we've named about 1.5 million other species of animal and plant clinging to its surface. It's our home, it's everything we have. It provides us with food and water and clean air to breathe, and it's our source of inspiration and beauty. And so you'd think we would prize it above all else and look after it. But of course, you know where I'm going with this. We're not. We're making a real pig's ear of our lovely planet. There's a whole bunch of intertwined environmental catastrophes looming on the horizon if we don't wake up and do something about it very soon. Everyone's heard of climate change at the top there. You've probably heard of all the others at some point as well, but they get much less attention, but nonetheless are all really major issues. Things like soil erosion, the pollution of streams and the sea and soils and the air with heavy metals and pesticides and fertilizers and plastics and so on, deforestation, overfishing. I could go on at length and it would be terribly depressing. Let's skip to the bottom. Biodiversity loss. That's my kind of speciality, I suppose, these days. Scientists agree we're now globally in the 6th mass extinction event. Species are going extinct faster now than they have for at least 65 million years since the last mass extinction, which was when the meteor struck and wiped out the dinosaurs. But this extinction event is unique because it's being caused by a species on the planet, us, of course. Now, when you start talking about extinctions, people tend to think of big creatures, of charismatic, beautiful animals like tigers or polar bears or giant pandas or dodos or whatever. They don't normally immediately start thinking about insects. But recent evidence has emerged suggesting that insects are declining just as fast, if not more quickly, than the larger creatures that we spend much more time and attention and money on trying to look after. And this really came to the sort of forefront of people's minds in 2017, or at least some people's minds, when a study emerged from Germany. You might remember it. It was covered in lots of newspapers around the world. It's sometimes called the Krefeld study. It's based on data collected by insect enthusiasts, many of them amateurs, who took it upon themselves to put malaise traps on German nature reserves from the late 1980s onwards. Now, a malaise trap is a kind of tent-like thing. There's a picture of one there. It catches flying insects, and they put them on nature reserves all across Germany, 63 different sites, and continued monitoring. They're still going to this day, in fact. And what this chart shows you is the average weight of flying insects caught per trap per day, and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. And you can see fairly obviously it declined overall. Well, it's a bit messy. On average, the catch fell by 76% in 26 years. So seemingly 3/4 of the flying insects disappeared from Germany in less than half my lifetime. And that's really alarming, particularly if it's representative of other places. So, as I say, when this was published, it got a lot of newspaper coverage, and it got people talking. You know, is there some kind of global catastrophe going on that we haven't really noticed? Or is it something weird happening in Germany? Well, we don't sadly have similar data sets from other countries, because we didn't have keen entomologists running this kind of monitoring scheme in any other country apart from Germany. But we do have other data sets from other countries, some from the UK, which suggest that Germany isn't unique, that insect declines are a general phenomenon. So, for example, in the UK, what we don't have an overall insect monitoring program, but we do have a really good monitoring scheme for butterflies, which is based on amateur recorders and walking transects and counting butterflies every fortnight through the spring and summer. And so here you can see the data going back to 1976, which is more or less when this started. Common butterflies at the top and the sort of rare habitat specialists at the bottom. And you can see that both have declined. The common ones down 46% since 1976, and the rare ones down a really concerning 77%, despite an awful lot of conservation effort focused on those rare butterflies. Hasn't been terribly successful, sadly. That's a slightly longer time period, but nonetheless, it shows that insect declines are perhaps a generality. I could show you lots of other similar graphs from other countries, but I'll spare you. For bees, which are my speciality, we don't have any long-term data sets on their abundance. Not for wild bees anyway. But we do have maps, and we can look at the distributions of species over time and how they've changed. And so this is just one example. This is one of our, I think, one of our most beautiful bumblebees, the great yellow bumblebee. Bombus distinguendus is its Latin name. And the map there just shows you its distribution in the first 50 years of the 20th century. And then that's the second half of the 20th century, and then today. It's undergone a really spectacular range contraction. It's extinct in England and Wales, so obviously its population has shrunk. We don't know exactly how many bees there used to be and how many there are today, but clearly there are far fewer than there were. And the great yellow isn't alone. Quite a few of our bumblebee species have undergone similar contractions, and 3 have gone extinct completely within the UK. So clearly there is serious cause for concern. But the slightly sad thing, I think, is that really nobody noticed any of this until that German study was published. People don't tend to look that closely at insects. So they've been slowly disappearing, so far as we know, for decades, but largely it's been ignored. There's just one aspect of their decline, which some of you will have been aware of, depending on your age. And as soon as I show you this picture, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, I suspect. So if you're over the age of about 40, perhaps 45, you probably remember a time when you were a kid when if you went for a long drive in the summer in your parents' car on summer holiday or whatever, you had to stop every few hours to scrub the windscreen clean because it became impossible to see where you were going because of all the splattered insects, poor things, all over it. Today, that just doesn't happen. You can drive for hours in a beautiful day in July and you may have one or two of these splats, but you certainly don't have to stop to clean the screen. But it's kind of sad, isn't it, that this is pretty much the only aspect of insect declines that most people have registered. Anyway, we should be worried about the disappearance of insects because they're really important. And that was put very nicely by E.O. Wilson, who is a bit of a hero of mine. He's an American biologist and all-round clever chap. And this is a quote from him from a few years ago now. I won't read it all out, but he basically said that if people were to somehow disappear from the planet, it would do very nicely without us. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would, as he put it, collapse into chaos. And I need to explain why he said that and why I think he's absolutely correct. So firstly, insects make up the bulk of biodiversity. I mentioned earlier that we've so far named about 1.5 million species of animal and plant on our planet. Well, 1.1 million of those are different types of insects. So they're more than 2/3 of all biodiversity. And what's more, there are suspected to be perhaps another 3, 4, 5 million insects that we haven't yet even named. Anyway, so they are the bulk of life on Earth, but they're also food for a great many of the creatures that aren't insects. Many of them creatures that we're perhaps more attached to than insects, things like these beautiful bee eaters. A great many species of bird rely on insects for food, as do bats, freshwater fish like salmon and trout, amphibians, reptiles. All sorts of animals are losing their food supply if insects are disappearing. So imagine you're one of these gorgeous bee eaters living in Germany. Seemingly 3/4 of your food supply has disappeared in the last 26 years, which is obviously going to have a significant impact. But insects aren't just important as food. Because they're so numerous and there's so many different species, they're involved in more or less every ecological process you might care to think of. So for example, they're really important biocontrol agents. They help to control numbers of pests. They're recyclers of dung and dead bodies and trees and leaves and all sorts of other organic materials. They help to keep the soil healthy. They help to distribute seeds. They do all sorts of things, which is why, of course, that E.O. Wilson said that the environment would collapse into chaos without them. But most of this stuff just goes on under our noses without anyone giving them credit for what they're doing, without anyone appreciating the importance of these little creatures. And I thought it'd be worth spending a couple of minutes just looking in a bit more detail at a couple of these creatures here, because they're probably creatures you don't know terribly much about, but I think they deserve considerably more attention than they get. So firstly, this lovely little thing, tiny insect, it's only 3 or 4 millimeters long. It's a lacewing larvae. These are really important biocontrol agents. So they have those curved jaws that they stick into aphids and they suck the juice out of them. But this particular lacewing is quite interesting because it then sticks the shriveled husk of its prey on its back. And it builds up this kind of crazy wig of dried aphids. We don't really know why they do it. It's probably camouflage, but no one's ever investigated. Anyway, fascinating little beasts. And then there are these creatures much more familiar to everybody, earwigs. Much maligned, I think, because most people don't like earwigs. I don't know why. They find them a bit kind of creepy and scurry, creepy crawlies. And of course, they've got those terrifying pincers at the rear end, which people think are gonna nip them, which of course is a bit silly because they're so tiny and feeble that you can barely feel the pinch if they do pinch you. Anyway, farmers used to spray to kill earwigs, particularly in orchards, because they were seen as a pest. They do nibble blossom a little bit, but they don't really do much damage. And actually quite recently it was discovered that just like the lacewing larvae, they're really important biocontrol agents. Earwigs are, they're nocturnal creatures, and at night, in the evening, they scurry up the trunks of apple trees and other trees and spend the night feeding in the canopy on aphids and other small insect pests. And then in the early morning, they run back down the trunk and find somewhere to hide. And someone calculated that a healthy earwig population in an apple orchard does the same amount of pest control as the farmer could achieve by spraying 3 times with insecticide. So they're doing a really important free job of pest control if we only look after them. They're also just quite fascinating insects. So they're a rare example of an insect that shows parental care. This is a female earwig in her nest with her eggs that she guards, and her young nymphs, the little babies have just hatched, some of them. And she protects them and feeds them until they're about half grown. And then she shoos them out of the nest, at which point, if they don't leave, she eats them. So she's not a perfect mother, but nonetheless, fascinating little creatures. Of course, there's one thing that insects do that everyone is aware of, and that's this, pollination. Many people have a misconception that pollination is done almost entirely by bees. I love bees to bits. They are my favorite creatures. I've spent 30 odd years studying them. But to be fair to the other insects, bees are far from the only pollinators. In the UK, it was recently estimated that there are at least 4,000 species of insect that pollinate. So there, as well as the bees, there are moths and butterflies. There are lots and lots of species of flies and wasps and beetles and so on, all of them busy visiting flowers, spreading pollen from flower to flower. And between them, ensuring that our wildflowers set seed. So globally, 87% of plant species need pollinating by some kind of animal. And in tropical places, that animal might be a hummingbird or a bat, or even a lizard in 1 or 2 weird cases. But in Europe, it's all done by insects. So without these little pollinators, then all of the beautiful flowers that we appreciate in the countryside would not reproduce and would eventually disappear. And of course, as everyone knows, pollinators are also vital for us directly through pollinating our crops. So we've become used to our supermarkets being full of this amazing range of fruit and veg, flown in from all over the world, available for 12 months of the year. If we didn't have insect pollinators, it wouldn't look anywhere near so good. We wouldn't have apples, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, courgettes, pumpkins, tomatoes, chili peppers. I could go on and on and on, obviously. Even things like coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollination. So life without them would be really difficult. And the horrible truth actually is that people would starve if we didn't have insect pollinators. We desperately need to avoid ending up like these people. So forgive me if you've seen these pictures before. They have been shown a few times, but I think they're kind of fascinating and chilling at the same time. So these seemingly cheerful pictures show people in southwest China in their traditional dress, smiling away. But what they're doing is what's worrying. They're hand pollinating the apple and pear trees because there aren't any pollinators left in that region to do it for them. So the people act like human bees, and they send their children climbing up high to get the higher flowers that the adults can't reach. It's hard to imagine farmers in Europe hand pollinating their fields of oilseed rape and so on. So we need to make sure that this doesn't happen everywhere. Which brings me to the more positive second half of my talk, which is what we can do about all this doom and gloom. And there's a lot of good news here, because so a lot of these environmental issues that I touched upon right at the beginning, you do feel completely helpless, don't you? When you know, I remember seeing the television film footage of the Amazon burning last summer, and you know, feeling completely frustrated and sad and helpless. But with insects, it's different because they live all around us. They're in our gardens, our parks, they're along the road verges. And most of them haven't gone extinct yet. And they'll recover really quickly if we just provide them with some habitat to live in. Because unlike rhinos or tigers, they breed really fast. So their populations could recover in just a year or two if we took steps to provide them with somewhere to live, which we can all get involved in doing. Now, we shouldn't forget about the farmed countryside. 70% of Britain is farmland, and the way we farm has become increasingly hostile to wildlife over the last 70 or 80 years. And there's some really difficult issues there about how we make farming more wildlife friendly. But what I'm going to focus on today is a much easier, a much more easily influenced area, which is what we can do in urban areas, in our gardens, in our parks, and so on. So there are about 22 million private gardens in the UK, covering an area of somewhat more than 400,000 hectares. So that's about 1 million acres if you want old money. And that's not counting the other kind of urban green spaces, the parks, the cemeteries, the roundabouts, the road verges, and so on. And so just imagine if most of those gardens were managed in a wildlife-friendly way, were full of bee-friendly flowers, were pesticide-free, things I'm going to talk about in a second. And imagine all those urban green spaces, all the road verges were full of flowers, linking up the gardens and the towns. That's a national network of insect-friendly, wildlife-friendly habitat. And this isn't just a kind of, idle fancy. This is something that's actually already happening, which I think is really exciting. It's great to see that councils are already taking this on board. They're already changing their cutting regimes and so on. And gardeners are taking this on board. There's a huge demand for bee-friendly flowers from the garden centres and so on, because people want to invite nature into their gardens. So it's kind of an easy win. And it's something I think we should really push along as fast as possible to basically invite nature in to live in our gardens. As you can probably tell, I'm quite excited about this, and which is why I've written, sorry, I had to get in a little book plug at some point. Probably be another one before long, so watch out. Anyway, so if you're at all interested in wildlife gardening, then check out The Garden Jungle, which I wrote a couple of years ago, or the new one is Gardening for Bumblebees that came out last month. Gardening for Bumblebees is more of a practical manual, kind of how-to guide. Anyway, you don't really need to buy either of them because I'm going to tell you the highlights now, or you can check out my YouTube channel, which is obviously free. So gardening is, we all think, a green activity, isn't it? What could be more green than growing flowers and fruits and vegetables in your garden? But actually, it really depends how you do it. Gardening can actually have a huge negative environmental footprint. So if your idea of gardening is to jump in the car at the weekend and drive to an out-of-town garden superstore and get a big trolley and throw in a whole load of annual bedding plants in disposable plastic pots and peat-based compost, probably drenched in pesticides, which I'll come back to later. And then you might shove a big sack full of peat-based compost in the bottom of your trolley and a bottle of Roundup to kill the weeds and a bottle of Bug Clear to get rid of the bugs and a bottle of fertilizer to spray and increase the fertility of your flower beds or vegetable beds or whatever. You can see what I'm saying, that actually all of that is pretty harmful to the environment. And so actually your garden can be, or your gardening activities can do much more harm than good. And at its absolute worst, a garden can be an awful sterile place. This, in case you can't tell, is plastic grass. And people actually do this. Unfortunately, while some of us are making our gardens as wild as possible, other people are making them as sterile and boring as possible, it seems to me. In fact, there's a new plastic front lawn about 100 yards to my right. Almost made me weep to see it. Anyway, so gardens can be appalling places for wildlife, or they can be amazing places for wildlife. It just depends how you do it. And how good they can be is illustrated really nicely by an example from Leicester. There's a lady called Jenny Owen who lives in Leicester. She's 86 now. She lives in an urban central Leicester. She has a small garden. It's about 1/8 of an acre, 0.07 of a hectare. It's nothing special to look at. This isn't it, by the way. I haven't got a picture of her garden. But she's got some bee-friendly flowers and a pond and a few shrubs and whatnot. Nothing amazing. But what is amazing is she spent 35 years cataloguing every plant and animal species she could find in her garden. And I mean, you've got to give her top marks for dedication. After 35 years, the grand total of species she'd counted was 2,673 in her little urban garden, of which 1,997 were different types of insect. So there's just this potentially at least extraordinary biodiversity, like your own rainforest, just right under your nose in your back garden if you just do the right things to encourage it. So what are those things? Well, the first thing, of course, that most people would think about is what flowers should I grow? What plants should I grow to encourage wildlife? And that's pretty tricky, actually, because we're very much spoiled for choice. I read this estimate, I don't know how they worked it out, but that there are somewhere in the region of 70,000 different varieties or cultivars or species of plants that you can buy somewhere from a garden centre in the United Kingdom. So we're completely spoiled for choice. As a gardener, it's really hard to know where to start because you've never heard of a lot of these plants that you might buy and grow. So I'm going to try and give you a few kind of simple rules of thumb to start with about which plants to choose. So one simple rule is avoid what are usually called double varieties. By double varieties, they mean plants with extra sets of petals. And hundreds of double varieties are available in garden centres. So I've just put up pictures of 3 of them there: roses, cherries and hollyhocks. All of them available in single varieties and in double varieties. The single varieties are really attractive to insects. The double varieties tend to be pretty useless because actually they're mutants in which the anthers, the bits that produce the pollen, the male parts of the flower, which you can see in the rows bottom left there, those little orange dots, they're the anthers that produce the pollen. In a double flower, they've mutated into extra petals. So there are no anthers, there is no pollen, there's just a bundle of petals, which from a bee's perspective is absolutely useless. So next time you're choosing plants, keep an eye out and avoid those double varieties. And also just generally, most annual bedding plants are pretty rubbish. Things like begonias and busy lizzies and petunias and so on. Most of them have been very intensively bred over hundreds of years by plant breeders trying to create things that they could sell that appeal to the human eye. But in doing so, they've usually lost their original function because, of course, flowers originally evolved not to please us, but to attract insects. That's why they have colourful petals and scents and nectar and so on, is to attract a pollinator. But by tinkering with them, just like with the double varieties, most of these annual bedding plants have a structure that is impossible for insects to get into, or they don't produce any nectar, or they have no pollen, or for one reason or another, they're pretty useless. So avoid all of those things. The gnome is a personal preference. And head instead for kind of, as a rule, traditional cottage garden annuals and perennials. This is a little corner of my garden, which I can see just behind the screen. This picture was taken last year, so the flowers aren't out quite yet, but anyway. But that still leaves you an awful lot to choose from. Hundreds and hundreds of species. So most people can't grow hundreds of species of plant in their garden. So which ones, how do you narrow it down further? Well, to try and do that, I teamed up with a nursery in Oxfordshire, Rosie Bee Nursery, which is run by a lady called Rosie Rowlings. And she conducted a trial. She selected 111 plant species or cultivars, all of them ones that are supposed to be good for pollinators of one type or another. And she grew them all in metre square plots alongside one another in her nursery. And then for 5 years, she counted all the insect visitors to each plant through the spring and summer, so that we could calculate which were really the best when grown in identical conditions side by side. And so I'm just going to show you a few highlights of the study. If you want to know more, you can actually read the whole thing. It's open access, so if you Google it, you'll probably find it pretty easily. It's a slightly boring scientific study to read, but it has all the details about exactly how many insects were attracted to each plant species. But anyway, the highlights are this. First of all, the top three, the kind of gold place, silver and bronze are here. And I was really surprised by the overall winner. In fact, if I'm completely honest, I'd never even heard of the overall winner until Rosie ran her trial. Lesser calamint, who would have thought it? A really not particularly spectacular little thing. But anyway, pollinators absolutely love it. I've planted a whole patch of it in my garden now, and it's just going to flower this year. So I'll let you know if Rosie was right, but that seems to be a top tip for attracting lots of insects. Then the Helenium, the yellow daisy there, came second, and the geranium variety called Rosanne came third. Most hardy geraniums are really good for insect life. But what's interesting is if you then break down the insect visits to different plants according to the type of insect, you get completely different patterns according to which type of insect you look at. And I'm not going to show you them all, but I'm going to show you the best ones for bumblebees, because they're my favorites. So these are the top 5 plants in terms of the number of bumblebees attracted. And you can see that they're completely different. They don't overlap with the overall winners at all. So the very best plant for bumblebees is Viper's bugloss, which is a native wildflower. Pictured bottom left there. I should say that picture doesn't do it justice. It's a really beautiful native wildflower. It's biennial. Flower spikes a metre or so tall, looks gorgeous in July when it flowers, and it attracts a whole cloud of bumblebees. So every garden should have one. I won't talk you through all the others. They're probably all fairly familiar plants if you're a keen gardener. One final result from Rosie's trial is that wildflowers, native wildflowers, performed on average better than non-natives, which is probably what you'd expect, because native wildflowers have co-evolved over thousands or even millions of years with our native insects. So you'd expect them to be attractive to them. And the best native wildflowers in her trial were these 3. Marjoram was number 1 overall, which I should say every garden should have some marjoram. It's a lovely native wildflower, attracts loads of insects, including particularly butterflies love it, as well as bumblebees and all the rest. And of course, you can use it in your cooking, and it's just generally lovely. Then Viper's bugloss was second, and Greater knapweed was third. All of them plants that I would recommend anyone grow in their garden if they've got space. So it's not perhaps surprising that these native wildflowers are good for insects, but this kind of brings me on to a slightly controversial topic, which is the topic of weeds. So if you're a gardener, you're taught almost from birth that some plants are kind of undesirable. They're a sign that you're a poor gardener if these are found in your garden. And the 3 classic examples are on the screen here. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you what they are, but dandelions, spear thistle, ragwort, all of them plants that most self-respecting gardeners would immediately kill if they found in their garden, which is kind of sad, isn't it? Because of course, they're native wildflowers and they're really attracted to insects. And if you stop to think about it, they're actually just really pretty flowers. So why do we go to such extraordinary lengths to get rid of them? It's actually kind of odd. And I would ask you all to just kind of slightly rethink your attitude to what's commonly called weeds. And ideally, you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by just calling them all wildflowers. Okay. A couple more ways you can get more flowers and more happy bees and other pollinators in your garden. Firstly, if you've got space, flowering shrubs and trees are fantastic. My particular favorites are fruit trees. I've got a garden full of different apples and plums and quinces and pears and so on. And I even make my own cider. There it is. But of course, the fruit trees have this beautiful blossom period, which is just finishing, coming to an end now, where they provide a mass of food for all sorts of different pollinators. And in exchange for that food, the pollinators ensure you get a lovely crop of 0 food miles, hopefully 0 pesticides, 0 packaging fruit. for your family later in the year. Wins all round, I would say. And so, of course, you may think if you've got a small garden, you haven't got room, but actually you can get fruit trees on dwarfing rootstock, some of them so small that you can easily grow them in a pot on a patio. So you don't need much room for a small fruit tree, but if you've got room, have a big one. I should also say, I think it would be great if councils planted more fruit trees in urban parks and urban areas generally, and just made them, you know, free for people to go and pick their own fruit in summer. It seems a great way to reconnect people with where fruit comes from rather than buying it all from the supermarket. Anyway, I'm going off on a slight pet hobby horse there. The final way you can get more flowers squeezed into your garden is where we intersect with the talks from Emma and Diane, which is the way you manage your lawn. So the classic English garden has a big lawn, usually a rectangular lawn surrounded by flower beds. And for many decades, there's been this kind of aspiration amongst gardeners to have a beautiful kind of replica of a Wimbledon tennis court in their back garden, ideally with straight lines up and down. My dad still aspires to this. He's 88, but he still tries to mow neat stripes in his lawn. Why are we, I mean, I can sort of see the aesthetic appeal, but it's really sad, isn't it? Because a neat mowed lawn is pretty hopeless for wildlife. It supports almost nothing. If you just stop mowing, most lawns will burst into flower. So this is my lawn, and I haven't sown any wildflowers in it at all. I didn't need to, because as you can see, it's full of flowers. All you have to do is stop mowing and they all start blooming. So there's red clover, white clover, buttercups, dandelions, self-heal, speedwells, all sorts of lovely things in there. So if we could persuade people to just relax a bit, and instead of getting out the mower, just get out the deck chair and make themselves a cappuccino or a gin and tonic and sit down and just enjoy watching all the lovely insects coming to visit their flowering lawn. Wouldn't that be great? And of course, it isn't just lawns. We have a lot of mown grassland in our towns, in amenity land, in land managed by the council, as Emma spoke about, and that too has huge potential. For decades and decades, it's been mown over and over again by teams of workmen and women through the spring and summer. Lots of councils used to cut their verges and parks and so on 8 or more times a year. Think of all the petrol and the labour involved. And it's just not necessary, as we've already heard. And it's fantastic to hear so many councils changing policy since the lockdown last year, since the realisation that these verges look so much better if they're not cut. So one option is to just leave them uncut, or well, they do need cutting at least once a year, as Emma talked about, and that does pose certain challenges. But they don't need cutting 8 times a year. That's just a waste of time and money as far as I can see. Not all verges will look wonderful if you don't cut them. And sometimes it may be worth considering sowing a wildflower seed mix to improve the biodiversity, particularly in urban areas where the verges may be recently sown grass with little natural botanical diversity. There's a really nice little volunteer group in Stirling in Scotland, where I used to work actually, though they call themselves On the Verge, and they spend their weekends digging over and sowing wildflowers on any bit of boring mown grass that they can persuade the council to let them get their hands on. So here's a road verge that the year before was just boring mown grass, and now look at it, and there's a roundabout. And there's one little group of keen volunteers with no funding from anywhere, so far created 93 patches like this dotted around the city of Stirling. So everywhere you go, there are flowers where there used to be nothing. Wouldn't it be great if every roundabout and every road verge was full of wildflowers? I think that has enormous potential. And what's so exciting is that it seems to be happening. We just need to spread the word, and we need, above all, to combat the people who will complain, because there are still people out there who will write to their council and say, that looks awful, it should be mowed, you're being lazy, why aren't you cutting the verges, or it's dangerous, or whatever. So we needed to be more people writing to the council saying, it looks fantastic, please don't cut it. And hopefully we can win that battle. And hopefully also we can put an end to stuff like this. So this is kind of the antithesis of what I was just showing you. I'm sure you can tell what this is, or can guess what this is. Obviously it was a little patch of greenery around the base of a silver birch tree. But you see this kind of thing over and over again if you walk or cycle around any urban area in Britain, or almost any urban area. This is a result of someone from the local council coming along and spraying that bit of vegetation with herbicide. It was probably just grass. I doubt there was anything very exciting there, but there were probably a few insects living amongst it. It was a little bit of life in an otherwise sterile pavement. And now it's completely dead. Why did they do that? What was the point? Why do we employ teams of people with tanks of herbicide to travel the streets looking for anything green and killing it? It just seems like crazy environmental vandalism to me. And aside from the environmental impacts, it's worth bearing in mind that the chemical usually used, Roundup, with the active ingredient glyphosate, it's become probably the most controversial pesticide in the world because there's a really substantial body of evidence suggesting, more than suggesting, that it causes cancer in humans. So we're spraying our pavements, the edges of the parks, the paths in the parks, the edges of school playgrounds, with something that will probably give us cancer, as well as obliterating wildlife. That's just completely nuts, if you ask me. Anyway, if I had my way, I would ban pesticides in urban areas. I just can't see the point or the need for them. And in fact, there are plenty of countries that have already, plenty of cities that have already done this. France is the first country to do this. They last year banned the sale of pesticides to anyone who isn't a registered farmer. So you can't buy these things if you're a gardener, and you can't buy them if you're the local authority. So by default, Paris and every other French city is now completely pesticide free. If Paris is pesticide free, why can't London be pesticide free? Why can't every city be pesticide free? It seems like a no-brainer to me that would be sensible. If you're a keen gardener, you might be thinking at this point, but what do I do if I'm not allowed to use pesticides? When I get an outbreak of aphids on my roses, on my runner beans or whatever, you know, how am I going to cope? Well, I'm a keen gardener and I grow lots of vegetables and flowers. And most years on my runner beans, I do get some black bean aphids, but I don't do anything. I just wait. And usually within a week or two, a whole army of little helpers come dashing over the horizon and eat them all for me. You've already seen some of these earlier in the talk, but there is a whole host of lovely little native predators that will eat them. Just occasionally, in a bad year, the aphids don't all get eaten and they continue to munch my beans, and I get a few fewer runner beans than I might have done. But isn't it better to have a few fewer beans in your garden than to have beans covered in pesticide? It seems to me a pretty simple choice. So probably because you're listening to this kind of talk, you may not use insecticides in your garden. I hope you don't. But there are two ways that you might inadvertently be bringing them into your garden without really knowing it or thinking about it. And I just want to warn you about these. The first is that most of the ornamental plants that you might buy in garden centres to put in your garden have been drenched in pesticides during their rearing. And this isn't idle conjecture on my part because we tested it. A couple of years ago now, we drove around all the big name garden centres, B&Q, Wyvale, Home Base, all those kind of places. And we deliberately bought the plants they were selling as bee friendly or perfect for pollinators, marked with little logos, specifically trying to target customers who wanted to invite wildlife into their gardens. And we bought them, we took them back to the lab and we tested them for pesticides. Every plant bar one contained at least one pesticide. Some of them contained as many as 10 different pesticides. There was one little heather plant that had 5 insecticides and 5 fungicides in that poor little plant. A whole toxic cocktail. 75% of these bee-friendly plants contained insecticides. 70% contain things called neonicotinoid insecticides, which have become notorious for being really poisonous to bees. And they're in plants being sold as bee friendly, which I think is really outrageous. So you've been warned. The other way you might accidentally bring pesticides into your garden is via your dog or cat. Lots of us have dogs or cats or both. And if we do, and if you take them to the vet for any reason at all, there's a pretty good chance your vet will try and sell you a monthly health plan, which will include a flea treatment that is intended to be dripped on the neck of your dog or cat once a month. The two best-selling brands in the UK are up here, Advocate and Frontline. These are both insecticides. They're really toxic, neurotoxic insecticides. In fact, Advocate here says in tiny letters on the front of the box, imidacloprid. That's a neonicotinoid insecticide. I just mentioned them. They were banned from farming use because of the clear evidence that they were harming bees. They're incredibly poisonous to bees. And so they're not allowed for farmers anymore, but you can still buy them and drip them on your dog. Isn't that strange? And the dose that you should put on your dog once a month on a medium-sized dog is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. Now, probably bees aren't going to come and feed on your dog, so the bees aren't at risk, but freshwater insects are, because these are water-soluble chemicals. And if your dog jumps in your garden pond or the local canal or river, most of that is going to wash off. And that's a huge dose of insecticide going into our fresh waters. And again, this isn't just idle speculation. We published a paper 3 months ago based on Environment Agency data for 20 English rivers, every one of which was positive for one or both of these insecticides at levels exceeding the safe limits, exceeding the levels that will harm insect life in those rivers. And the only place they can plausibly be coming from, I think, is from these flea treatments. So do beware if you, next time you go to the vet, resist his recommendation that you drip insecticide all over your dog or cat. Okay, so just to move away from the doom and gloom again, just a few finishing touches to your insect-friendly garden. Firstly, every garden should have a bee hotel, I think. These are to provide homes for solitary bees, of which we have about 250 species in the UK. Bees that don't live in a colony with a queen and workers, but where a female bee just makes her own nest on her own. And some species of solitary bee will happily nest in horizontal tunnels that we provide for them in the form of bee hotels. They're really easy to make. On the left there is a rather ugly one I made just by drilling holes in an old fence post. It looks awful, but it works. And actually within 20 minutes of my drilling those holes, I had my first visitors. I had some red mason bees coming to inspect. That's a red mason bee, top right there. They're on the wing right now, in fact. And later in the year, a few of the holes that hadn't been filled up by mason bees were occupied by leafcutter bees. And you can see those bottom right there, named leafcutter bees because they like to line their tunnel with little snippets of leaf that they collect, as you can see. You don't have to have an ugly thing like that. You can make a really neat one with a nice, neat block of wood with neat lines of holes if you have any carpentry skills at all. All by chopping up bits of bamboo, cane, fun projects you can do with the kids or the grandchildren at the weekend. And they usually work. No guarantees, but if you hang something like this on a south-facing wall or fence, there's a very good chance you'll get bees moving. If you've got no DIY skills at all, you could buy a bee hotel. There are loads of designs out there, some better than others. This, I think, is a really nice one. It's from a company called Nurturing Nature up in Liverpool. And the reason it's particularly good is it has a window on the side. So you can actually see what's happening in the tunnels, which you can't with most bee hotels. So you take that little door you can see on the side there, and you can look inside. And here on the right, you can see these are the offspring of those red mason bees. You can see the little yellow piles of pollen and these fat grubs eating the pollen. and each grub is separated by a little curved, beautifully made clay wall that the mother collected and built. That's why they're called mason bees. Anyway, every garden should have one. Also, much less well known than a bee hotel, I think every garden should also have a hoverfly lagoon in a quiet corner. These, briefly, by the way, if you want to know how to make one, I've made a YouTube video you could check out. These are to provide homes for some species of hoverfly that have aquatic larvae, and they like to lay their eggs in small puddles containing water and organic matter. So they're dead easy to provide a home for. All you need is some kind of waterproof container and fill it with water, chuck in some leaves or lawn clippings, and usually within a few days, it will attract a female hoverfly. And they're really gorgeous insects. They're pollinators. It'll lay its egg, or usually a clump of eggs, on the edge of the water. And they hatch quite quickly into these glorious creatures at the top. It's a bit of a shame they have such an unfortunate English name. They're usually called rat-tailed maggots, which doesn't sell them to people terribly well. But they're actually kind of fascinating. The grub has this long tail, so it's actually a snorkel, a breathing tube, so it can hide in the soupy liquid where a bird can't see it and send up its tail to the surface to breathe. Anyway, and then the finishing touch, why not also have a crack at making an earwig hotel? I told you why earwigs were important earlier. And we've just been trialing different designs of hotel for them, basically somewhere they can hang out in the daytime that's safe from being eaten by birds, so that you can encourage them to control the pests on your fruit trees at night. And this design seems to work really well, and it couldn't be simpler. Just an old plant pot stuffed full of straw and wire it onto a tree trunk, ideally on your apple tree, and off you go. Actually, there are lots of other things I could have told you about as well. Ponds are fantastic for insect life, log piles, all sorts of other things, but I didn't have time. I've stuck to what I thought were the most interesting bits and bobs. Just to finish off, I want to go back to this kind of big picture stuff I started off with. We have this amazing planet, and I just don't understand why we're not looking after it better. You know, that as it's been said before, there is no planet B, and it really worries me that you know, people would do anything for their children apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. So we have to do better than that, and we can do better. And what better place to start than by looking after all the little creatures that live all around us in our gardens and parks. And road verges, let's not forget those. Okay, thank you all very much for listening. Before I stop, I will just flag up, there's yet another book coming out in August, Silent Earth. Watch out. Okay, that's it from me. I think we're having a break before questions.
Super, thank you so much, Dave. Wow, there's a lot of information there and lots of fantastic tips about what we can all do for our insects in our gardens. We've been hearing about the Roadside Verge initiatives as well. While you've been talking, Dave, an absolute flood of questions, which I've been trying to keep track of, which I've gathered. And we're going to come back to questions after a short break. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. Do get up, stretch your legs, grab a glass of water, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. And then we'll have about half an hour max for questions, but we'll see how many we can get through, if that's okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Hello. You want these green ones? There's those as well. Oh, thanks. Okay, everybody back. We've got Diane, Emma, and Dave. So Diane and Emma, if you could unmute. So I've got a whole list of questions that have been coming through. So we're ready to kick off with questions. The first question I've got, Emma was asking a question. Sorry, Valerie was asking a question. This is for you, Emma. What is your knowledge about what other councils are doing across Derbyshire? What do you sense there's a level of interest with other local councils and local authorities to head in the direction that you're heading?
I've been in discussion with High Peak Borough Council, who want to do something similar, and that would work quite well with some of the work that we're doing in the villages in the Hope Valley, because obviously that crosses over into High Peak. So we would be really keen to work with them on that, with the various communities up there. So yeah. Okay,
super. Just to tell everybody, there's lots and lots of questions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all the questions, but we'll do our best. A question from Mark to you, Dave, is is raking after mowing better? Because when mowers, when they come to mow at the end of the season and they take all the lots of the plant material off, does that mean they'll be removing seeds? And what does that mean for the long-term abundance of flowers on a roadside verge if you actually manage it in that way?
Yeah, so if you're cutting late enough, then most should have already fallen to the ground, or at least enough of them should have fallen to the ground that isn't an issue. You will remove some of them, no doubt. But it's important that we do cut and remove the cuttings, because it's basically mimicking the management of hay meadows, of traditional management that created this beautiful floristic diversity that we used to have. It helps to reduce the soil fertility. But people who are new to this, that always seems a bit counterintuitive, that reducing the soil fertility is good for flowers. But of course, high fertility is bad because it allows rank grasses and docks and nettles to swamp everything else out. The lower fertility, the more diversity of flowers you get. So taking off the cuttings every year means you're removing some of the nutrients every year and helping to keep the fertility of the soil low. So, and also cuttings, it tends to smother a lot of the smaller flowers that you might otherwise be wanting to encourage.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Emma, a question for you, and also probably for Dave. Someone's asked a question about where can you buy seed from plant species that are native to where you live, and how easy is it to be able to do that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because they tend to be quite, cover a broad range, and that's partly because obviously there's different soil types, different conditions, so they're trying to get as many different seeds in there, so at least some will grow wherever you sow that. So it is quite difficult to find seeds in your local area. I know people do, when they go out into the countryside, might take a few kind of seeds, and obviously we've got to be careful that we don't take too much of those. But a few seeds that fall to the ground, you could certainly use that. But on any large scale, I'm not aware of anyone, any companies that are selling local seeds.
Okay.
To particular areas.
Dave, have you got any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, there's some great wildflower seed companies. Emma's Gate we use a lot. You can find them online. But the best you can do really is they will guarantee that some of their seed mixes are UK only, but they sadly aren't able to provide Sussex only or Derbyshire or whatever. I guess that would be too fiddly to be practical. So as far as I'm aware, there aren't suppliers of local seeds, and
maybe there's an opportunity for somebody to.
Yeah, absolutely. If the demand was there, if there were enough people wanting it, then it could work. No, that would be really interesting. I've got a really interesting question here about the climate change issue, Dave, and should we be potentially looking to select plants that can deal with wetter winters and much hotter summers? Is there any guidance that you know of that can help there? No, it's a really good point, and particularly for long-lived plants that you're planting with the intention, like trees, for example, that you're hoping will be there in 20 or 50 years' time, then we should probably be mindful of the fact that the climate by then will be different. There's talk of, for example, looking to slightly further south in Europe to, for example, varieties of oak tree. Most of us aren't planting oak trees, but that naturally grow in France, for example, that are more tolerant of hotter summers and that kind of thing. It hasn't been investigated terribly much, and it isn't something that I think anyone is really, able to provide good advice on as yet. We're sort of conflicted because people want to plant native, but at the same time, the predictions suggest that quite a lot of our natives want to be able to live here in 50 years' time, sadly. So. We probably should be considering looking further south in Europe before we.
Right. I've got a question from Brenda. This one's probably for you, Emma, about the use of herbicides by borough councils, district councils. What is the position with your council about the use of herbicides on roadside verges?
Right. Well, Certainly in our parks and open spaces on Derbyshire Dales district land, we don't use any pesticides. We haven't used any in our parks and open spaces for a number of years, and now we've stopped using it on our other lands such as car parks and that sort of thing. So no, we don't use it. Right,
okay, no, thank you for that. There's a question here about, is anybody working with the National Rail? Because obviously you can imagine the land on either side of the railway tracks has got huge potential to be even better for wildflowers and wildlife. Are you aware of any plant life or are there any national initiatives with National Rail, Dave? Are you aware of that?
It's a really good question, but I'm afraid I haven't a clue. No.
Yeah, and you know what? I've logged that down, and I'm going to have a look at that. I'm also going to speak to colleagues at our national office to find out whether we have had any discussions with National Rail. So thank you for who. I forget who's raised that point, but thank you for that. We will look into that. There's a lovely comment here from Mark who said he's done No Mow May for 2 years and he's seen a significant rise in ground-dwelling bees, which is really good. A question here about mason bees. This is for you, Dave. Katrina said, I've got 6 mason bee houses on a warm brick garage wall. Actually, what food do they like? What can I plant for them? Do they like fruit trees? And she says she has to buy a new extra bee house every year because her bee estate keeps on growing.
Yeah, they will keep filling them up. They're quite generalist. They're short-tongued little bees. They absolutely love fruit trees, and they are very good pollinators of fruit trees. So, and if you plant plums flower first, and then pears come out, and then apples come out. So if you've got the room, have one of each, and then you get a continuity of forage right through the mason bee flight season.
Right. Okay, that's great. Thank you for that advice. We've got somebody from the US. I don't quite know where. He's got a question about neonics for you, Dave. So neonics are not banned in the US. What's the up-to-date situation regarding neonics at the minute in the UK? And also his other question is, how can you tell if you're buying bee-friendly plants from a garden centre whether or not they've been treated with neonics? There's no labels. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, so the situation in Europe is that neonics are basically banned for farming use, but not for dripping on your dog or cat. They are banned for horticultural use, so they shouldn't be in ornamental plants anymore, but there will be other insecticides, I can absolutely guarantee. But just one slight caveat, I said banned, but the European ban allows individual governments to grant derogations. So if farmers make a case that they can't grow a particular crop without using neonics, and the government agrees that that case is convincing, they can grant an exception basically. And we had that this year with sugar beet, where the sugar beet growers were granted a derogation. And then in the end, it happened because we had a late frost and it killed all the pests anyway. But the government give them permission to use neonics. So it's not an absolute ban, and that's somewhat frustrating, but it's still an awful lot better than what they have in the US and the rest of the world, where they're still, it's open season basically.
Thank you for that. Another one for you, Dave, from Paul. I have mining bees in my garden lawn. When is the best time to scarify the lawn for wildflower seeding that will not in any way damage or harm the bees?
Yeah, so it really depends which species of ground nesting bee you have, and there's no way of knowing without seeing them. But each species tends to have quite a short flight season. So if you just wait until the bees aren't active, then they'll still be there, but they'll be grubs, but they'll be 10 centimeters down or so in the soil.
Right.
So be quite safe from scarification. So he should be okay to go in and do whatever he wants.
Maybe a question for Diane with the Grow, Don't Mow, and also maybe for Emma. So Emma, how can you adopt a rural verge? If somebody was to come to you in your council, what would you say?
Yeah, if they came to us and they were a group, then we would look at the verge and first of all check if that was a verge that was appropriate, and we would work with them on that. So we would help, as we have with other groups, in the preparatory work of cutting and possibly scarifying if it required that, and cutting at the end of the flowering season. So yeah, I mean, if there are groups who are interested, then, you know, we'd like to hear from them for next year.
Well, isn't that fantastic? You know, the opportunity for all local communities to work on their local roadside verges with the councils, yourself and other councils, that sounds quite good, Dave, doesn't it? I mean, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? If that's what, if we could head in that direction where local community groups, more local community groups are taking responsibility for their local verges, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Really good. Yeah. So a question for Dave, what's your view on new buildings having green roofs, green vertical walls? Do you think that's something that we should be looking at from the point of view of ongoing development?
Yeah, it's not something I could claim any great knowledge of, but it seems sensible. You know, the more plant life we can incorporate into the landscape, the better. And surely a green roof, green wall is better than a brick wall and a tiled roof. I think more research needs to be done on working out what are the best plants to grow to get the maximum, you know, value for wildlife. Because a lot of the ones that are usually used are not natives, but you know, I'm sure that can be improved with a bit of investigation. Yeah.
Okay. By the way, just coming back to the question of how can you adopt a rural verge, Diane, did you have any thoughts on that as well, from a point of view of working with local people and activating and mobilising local people?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some good examples driving even, you know, I think before these schemes started, and now outside Monash, I saw a little verge and it said, had a sign on and it said Roadside Nature Reserve on it. And I think as well, if people make it obvious when they've adopted something that that's what they're doing, it will spread the word a bit more so that other people realise they can do that, because this was news to us, wasn't it, that you could do this. So more that people who are doing this can share the fact that they're doing it, it'll encourage others to do it, I think. I know on our campaign, we're putting together a map of areas that people are leaving to grow. So again, that's another way to spur people on to do it and inspire them.
Yeah. Mandy said that she loves the idea of fruit trees being planted in public places. And I was recently visited a friend in Buxton, and what was really super was to see almost community orchards in public spaces where the local council, had planted fruit trees. I'm wondering, Emma, what your view on that would be with Derbyshire Dales District Council, the idea of planting fruit trees, which it'd be wonderful for people to, in the autumn, that in Buxton, they can go and collect the fruit, which is absolutely fantastic as a community activity, but also wonderful places for bees and insects, particularly in the blossom season.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea because, you know, the wildlife's going to benefit. They're an attractive tree, and that people will benefit in all sorts of ways. So, you know, we're you know, it's great if we want to encourage people to eat more fruit, and particularly for kids. Often, you know, I certainly know with my own kids, if they could pick their food that we were growing in the garden, then they would eat it. If I bought it from a shop and put it on the plate, they wouldn't eat it. So, you know, if kids can pick an apple and eat it, that would be great. So I do like that idea. I mean, obviously there's, you know, we need to, you know, put some thought into it, but, you know, it's something that we would consider.
If I could just chip in, Tim, sorry. It's astonishing. I mean, we import 70% of the apples we eat in this country, despite having a climate that's absolutely perfect for growing apples.
Is that right? 70%?
Yeah, astonishing, isn't it?
That is, yeah. It was so lovely to see those apple trees and pear trees in Buxton. I would just love to see this across the country in public spaces. That would be wonderful. That'd be really good. Is tannalized wood dangerous for bee houses? Lucy's asking this question, Dave.
Yeah, I don't know of any study of this, but it seems sensible to me to not use wood that's been treated. No, as I say, we don't know for sure, but it seems kind of likely that the poor things, if they're burrowing into a little hole, if the whole thing's impregnated with insecticide, that's not going to be good. Right,
okay. Another question, Dave, for you from Joe and Matt, sorry. The grass verge at the side of my house, they've left for over a month now. they seem to have got very little diversity at the moment. What can they do to make it more diverse? Do they just have to be patient, I suppose? Or?
Well, I mean, you can speed things up. You can scarify, as someone mentioned, and sow in seeds over the top. It doesn't usually work brilliantly because the grass comes back up very quick and tends to smother things. You can grow up plug plants, and I think it was Emma showed a picture of people doing that. You know, grow up some cowslips or whatever plant you'd like to see there that's appropriate for your area, and plant them out as well-established little plants. Clear a bit of space around them so they don't immediately get smothered. And you know, if it's a small area, that's perfectly practical.
Right. Okay. Is there an active campaign that you're aware of, Dave? This is a question from Mandy, challenging retailers who are selling poisonous bee-friendly plants. Is this issue being addressed?
No. So when we published that research, Friends of the Earth got on it, and they ran a campaign to try and get the garden centres to remove neonicotinoids specifically from their bee-friendly plants. And that succeeded, and all the big chains promised they would remove neonicotinoids, which were then promptly banned by the EU anyway, so it became irrelevant because they couldn't use them legally. But Friends of the Earth, to my frustration, wouldn't broaden it out because what really we should be demanding is pesticide-free bee-friendly plants. We shouldn't be focusing everything on one particular type of insecticide. We found lots of other insecticides in those plants, which are just as, well, some of them just as harmful as neonicotinoids. So, no, that was it. The Friends of Earth then lost interest and went off to do something else. So as far as I'm aware, right now, nothing is happening.
And there's no way that you can, as we discussed, there's no way you can actually tell about plants.
No way at all. Well, you can, but you need a very expensive machine that costs.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So.
Okay. Interesting question from Mark. If you could only plant one plant in your garden, Dave, what would it be?
Comfrey.
Comfrey.
Comfrey makes brilliant comfrey tea to fertilise the plants. Great for your tomatoes. Bees go mad for it. Yeah, comfrey. Dead easy to grow.
And then regarding mowing your lawn, how often would you recommend mowing your lawn in a given year if you wanted to maximise the biodiversity of the lawn?
To maximise biodiversity, I would just mow once at the end of the season. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. I have actually also seen where people have quite long grass where they actually mow a little kind of path through it if they want to get through to, and that always looks rather beautiful, doesn't it? It's really
it does. It makes the whole thing look deliberate, which
yeah.
for a lot of the skeptics who complain about it being untidy.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, we've got many more questions here. A question that actually was asked to about Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. Are we planning to work with Derby City Council to highlight the importance of biodiversity in the city? We have a really good close working relationship, I can say. But this is to Claire. We have in with Derby City Council, and that is only going to get bigger and better. So we are doing a lot of work with Derby City Council at the moment. Let me just check on that. Yesterday, I've seen, this is a question, Dave. Yesterday, I've seen a bumblebee which literally couldn't fly and was crawling on the ground for a long time. What on earth was going on?
That's pretty difficult to answer, but it could be that, so it may be that it had run out of energy. It couldn't find enough flowers. And if that's the case, then giving it a bit of sugar water might work to bring it back to health, and it'll fly off. But it could be diseased. There are a whole bunch of diseases that affect bumblebees. It could be that it was poisoned via a pesticide. There's just no way of knowing, I'm afraid. But right. If you're feeling, if you want to, try giving it some sugar water and it might help.
Because I remember hearing in a talk I heard you give, Dave, a few weeks ago. What's that fact about the amount of energy that a bee needs to visit over?
Yeah, so there's enough. Basically, bumblebees use a lot of energy to fly, and which means that they're only ever 40 minutes from running out of energy. And once they run out of energy, they can't take off, and so they can't get to a flower to stock up again. So they're in trouble. And there is this ridiculous calculation that so a running man burns the calories in a Mars bar in about an hour of running. But if you had a man-sized bumblebee, it would burn the calories in a Mars bar in 30 seconds of flight.
It's just astonishing.
It's impressive, isn't it? So yeah, they're
Very
kind of
astonishing, yeah.
guzzling insects. They use a lot of energy.
So many questions coming through here. We've probably got time for just maybe a few more. Dave, sorry everybody else, it's all about bees and insects for Dave, to Emma and Diane. We would like to make a log pile in a wild part of our garden, said Liz. Are there any particular trees which are better to use than others to attract insects?
That's a really good question. I don't know that any research has ever been done on that, but the obvious thing to say would be use natives if you have them available. But which native, I honestly couldn't tell you.
Okay. Vicky is asking about bee and bug hotels, about claims that bug hotels, whether bought or made, can actually cause disease, pests, and kill bees in large numbers. Is this true or not?
I don't think so. I mean, I know lots of people, and including myself, who've had bee hotels for years, and they seem to have a thriving population of bees around them every year. You do get parasites. You do get cuckoo bees. You get parasitic wasps. You get pollen mites. You get a whole range of other organisms associated with those bee hotels. But they're native too. They're just as interesting and important, I think, as the bees themselves. So it's, there's a whole little ecosystem there. I have no problem with that. So yeah, I think people are overly worried about this issue. Okay.
A question, Emma. Are you participating in No Mow May?
Oh, I'm afraid we're not actually, but maybe we should for next year. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Is there any particular reason why you weren't, or because you're?
I suppose yeah, I mean, that's something that we would certainly consider for next year, because I'd said in my presentation that we were looking at increasing the biodiversities of our parks and open spaces, and maybe that would be one way that we can do that. We could certainly leave areas unmown for May. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Cool. Probably the final question I've got, because it's getting to 9:20 now. Dave, do bee hotels need an annual spring clean?
It's kind of overlaps with the previous one. So if you really want to maximize the number of bees that you get in your bee hotel, you can clean them out. You need to have a bee hotel that can be dismantled. Some of them, it's just not possible. If it's bamboo canes, you can't get into them. If it's holes drilled in a solid block, you can't. But some of them are made with sort of planks that you can separate, and then you can, in the winter, you can clean them out. You can take out the little bee cocoons and put them to one side and put them in a little emergence box in the spring. And then you can scrub the rest of it completely clean. And it's a good way of getting rid of pollen mites, which I mentioned, which are a bit of a pain in bee hotels. If you get a really heavy infestation, they eat all the pollen and the baby bees starve. I don't bother, I have to say, and my bees seem to thrive without being cleaned out. And
okay.
Nests work perfectly well without being cleaned out by anybody. So I'm not sure that it's strictly necessary.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much. We've got a lot more questions. I can't answer all of them now, but we are going to gather questions and try and actually get back to people with answers at a later date. We'll have a look at those. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Dave, Emma, and Diane for joining us tonight. And also a big thank you to all of you who've joined as well. I think it's been a wonderful evening. We've learned a lot about the plight of bees and insects, but also what we can do about them. I hope many of you will take up the Grow, Don't Mow challenge from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. And we look forward to hearing, if you do that, how you get on doing that. So many thanks again, Dave, Emma, and Diane. And I hope those of you who've been watching have enjoyed tonight as well. Thank you so much.